This is the beginning of Unit 2 of the Americans, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. This unit is titled Bridge to the 20th Century, and it covers the years 1877 through 1917. On page 200 of your textbook, you'll see the beginning of Chapter 5, Changes on the Western Frontier. This chapter covers the time of 1870 through the year 1900. On page 200, you'll see the guiding questions for this chapter. What do you expect to find on settling in the West? What might be some ways to make a living on the Western frontier? If native peoples already live in your intended home, how will you coexist? How might settlers and Native Americans differ regarding use of the land? On page 202, Chapter 5, Section 1 begins, Cultures Clash on the Prairie. The main idea of this section is that the cattle industry boomed in the late 1800s as the culture of the Plains Indians declined. The main idea of this section is to connect the development of the industrial United States and the development of the Western territories with the decline of the Plains Indians. On page 203, you will see information describing the culture of the Great Plains Indians and a picture of a Sioux man and woman in the late 19th century. You'll see how the horse and the buffalo were essential to the culture of the Plains Indians, and how the organization of family life was very different than European or American traditions. The differences in the culture of the Great Plains Indian nations and the American settlers who pushed westward ultimately led to conflict and the destruction of the Plains Indians. In this section, Settlers Push Westward, you'll read about how Native Americans believed that land could not be owned, but that American settlers believed that owning land and improving that land and settling that land gave them a claim over the land. On page 204, you'll read about how the lure of silver and gold led to increased conflicts between the Plains Indians and American settlers. Once again, we see how the desire for natural resources leads one people to oppress another people. The government begins to restrict Native Americans, while it also does not restrict American settlers. The unequal treatment given to Native Americans and American settlers by the United States government was typical of the way that Native Americans were treated at this time. Despite treaties that the United States government had signed with the independent nations of the Native Americans, the United States repeatedly betrayed its own treaties and went back on its own word. An example of this unfair treatment of Native Americans is here in your textbook, where it says in 1834 the federal government had passed an act that designated the entire Great Plains as one enormous reservation. However, in 1850, the government changed its policy and created treaties that defined specific boundaries for each tribe. The Native Americans did not agree to these treaties and continued to hunt on their traditional lands, bringing them into conflict with settlers and miners. Here you read about the massacre at Sand Creek, where the United States Army descended upon the Sand Creek Reserve and killed over 150 women and children who were innocent of anything except being Indians. And here you'll read about the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was a treaty that was forced on the leaders of the Sioux Indian Nation in 1868. Sitting Bull was a leader of the Sioux Indian Hunkpapa tribe, never signed this treaty, and as a result, his people were hunted and slaughtered. On page 205, you will see how the United States government repeatedly took land from the Native Americans after the Civil War to give it away to industrialists. And notice that in 1819, the United States government told the Native Americans on the Great Plains that all of the land in purple would be theirs for, quote, eternity. However, eternity to the United States government means only a few years, because by 1894, the area in purple was what we left toward the Native Americans. And by the year 2000, that land had shrunk to just a few small islands of territory, usually in the least valuable, least hospitable areas of the nation. As the Native American Wars raged on, the number of atrocities committed against the Native Americans by the United States continued to mount. And in this section you'll read about the Red River War, which was a war between the Comanche Indian Nation and the United States. As part of the Native American Wars, you'll read about Colonel George A. Custer, who went to war in the Black Hills against the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho Indian nations. These Indian nations had done nothing to provoke the United States into a war except require that the United States honor its treaty obligations to them. However, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills, the United States began to clear out the Native Americans from the land it had been promised to them. General Custer was sent into the area to clear out the Sioux Indians and was ambushed by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. By defending their rightful territory from the aggression of the United States Army, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were forced to flee into Canada, where they remained until 1881. However, in order to prevent their own starvation, they were forced to surrender, and ultimately ended their days as a sideshow entertainment in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. The United States also conducted a program of assimilation. Assimilation is a plan under which Native Americans would give up their beliefs and way of life to become part of the white culture. We also need to ask ourselves about assimilation, whether or not this fits the definition of a genocide, both physically and culturally. On page 207, you'll read more about how the Dawes Plan attempted to assimilate the Native Americans. By limiting the amount of land that each Native American could have, it ultimately disrupted the nomadic tradition of the Native Americans. The destruction of the buffalo was perhaps the most significant blow to tribal life. In this section, you'll read about the importance of the buffalo to the Plains Indians. We also need to discuss whether the destruction of the buffalo was necessary to the development of the western states. By 1800, approximately 65 million buffalo roamed the plains. However, just 90 years later, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remained. Was this environmental genocide necessary? The Battle of Wounded Knee is important for two reasons. One, it represents the attitude of the United States towards the free practice of the religion of the Native Americans, but it also represents the revenge of the death of Colonel George Custer at the hands of the Sioux Indian. On December 28th, in the freezing cold, the 7th Cavalry, which was Custer's old regiment, rounded up 350 starving Indian Sioux and took them to a camp at Wounded Knee. The next day, a massacre breaks out, and while your textbook says that a shot was fired, from which side it was not clear, it is clear that the United States Army had entirely anticipated violence, having established positions with deadly cannon in advance of this confrontation. Army. For within minutes, the 7th Cavalry slaughtered 300 unarmed Native Americans, including several children. The soldiers left the corpses to freeze on the ground. Cattle becomes big business. One other thing we need to consider as we read about how cattle becomes big business is how this relates to the Civil War. After the Civil War, the question over Western states and their economy had been settled, with free soil being the way of the future. No longer would there be any question about who would call the shots in the Western states. The answer was that northern industrialists would control the development of the routes to the west. On page 209, you will read about how the cattle industry developed the western states. On this map, you'll see numerous cattle trails leading north out of Texas, where longhorn cattle were led to meet the growing railroad lines. The cattle would be then led onto the railroad cars and then taken to slaughterhouses in Kansas City, St. Louis, and Chicago, among other places. All of this new industry required an enormous amount of land. And as historians, we have to ask ourselves, where did these ranchers and railroaders get all of this land? The answer is very simple. They got it from the federal government. On page 212, you will see the vocabulary for Chapter 5, Section 1. Please continue to make vocabulary cards. Chapter 5.2, Settling on the Great Plains. The main idea of this section is that settlers on the Great Plains transformed the land despite great hardship. Settlers of the Great Plains would not have been able to survive without the railroad. The railroads received huge land grants from the federal government, about 170 million acres, worth about $500 million in 1871. After receiving free land from the federal government, wealthy industrialists in two companies began to lay railroad tracks across the West. They employed Civil War veterans, Irish and Chinese immigrants, African Americans, and Mexican Americans. After receiving enormous amounts of free land from the federal government, the railroad companies sold some of their land to farmers for $2 to $10 an acre. This stands as one of the greatest transfers of wealth in American history. The Congress passed the Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres of land free to any citizen or intended citizen who was head of a household. Some of the settlers in the West were known as exodusters. Exodusters were African Americans who moved from the Reconstruction South into the territory of Kansas. While government support for settlement did seem to benefit the common man, the best land often went to the railroads and the miners and the ranchers. Only about 10% of the land was actually settled by families for whom it was intended. Not all the plots of land were of equal value. The best land often went to the wealthiest and the most powerful people. On page 216, you'll see settlers meet the challenges of the plains. Experience on the frontier was very difficult and had an equalizing effect for men and women. In many ways, women had to be independent and as strong as men in order to survive on the frontier. In this picture, you'll see a pioneer family standing in front of their home on the frontier in Nebraska. This home is known as a soddy, which was a home made out of dirt. New technologies were developed to help the farmers in the West to settle the land. Here in this section, you'll read about how John Deere invented a steel plow that could slice through the heavy soil, and Cyrus McCormick began to mass-produce a reaping machine that would help in the harvesting of crops. The federal government also tried to help farmers by financing agricultural education. The Morrill Act established agricultural colleges that helped to turn the Midwest into the breadbasket of the nation. The collapse of the Bonanza Farm, the struggles of the small settlers, and the extermination of the Plains Indians raises certain questions we need to ask. Who really benefited from the development of the Great Plains? And was the development of the Great Plains done in an appropriate and ethical way? Chapter 5.2 ends with these vocabulary terms. Please add them to your growing list.